He glanced at her name tag, then at the worn edges of her order pad, and smirked. To Chu Yonghee, the waitress standing before him wasn't a human being. She was a backdrop to his performance of power, a convenient target for the cruelty he wore as casually as his tailored blue suit. He believed that by speaking in a dialect so obscure, so deliberately complex, that even native speakers struggled with its nuances, he could reduce her to nothing in front of his companion. He believed the regional Busan slang he'd weaponized would be his secret language, an invisible cage built from consonants and contempt. He was mistaken. What Chu Yonghee didn't know was that the woman refilling his water glass wasn't simply a waitress, and the response she was about to deliver wouldn't just answer his order. It would expose every secret he'd foolishly spoken aloud, unravel the criminal empire he'd spent years building, and prove that intelligence doesn't announce itself with expensive watches or corner offices. Sometimes it waits, patient and invisible, until arrogance hands it the perfect moment to strike. This is the story of a man who confused silence for ignorance and paid a price he never saw coming. Welcome to the channel. Before we watch this bully get the shock of his life, rate this video topic on a scale of 1 to 10 in the comments below. The atmosphere inside the Azure, Chicago's most exclusive Korean fusion establishment, carried the scent of gochujang-glazed wagyu, imported orchids, and inherited wealth. For Kathleen Perry, however, it mostly carried the weight of desperation. Kathleen tugged at the hem of her black server's shirt, which had faded from repeated washing and hung slightly loose on her frame. She'd lost weight over the past 6 months, the kind of weight that comes from choosing between eating and paying medical bills. It was 7:45 p.m. on a Thursday evening. The dinner service was reaching its crescendo. A symphony of murmured negotiations, clinking baccarat crystal, and conversations conducted in the international language of power and privilege, deals that would reshape markets, transactions that cost more than most people earned in a year, all discussed over $20 appetizers. Table 9 needs their banchan refreshed. Table 12 is complaining the SAM isn't authentic enough. Keep moving, Perry, don't think. The command came from Raymond Castellano, the front-of-house manager, a man whose definition of professional excellence was directly proportional to how invisible his staff could make themselves. He stood near the granite host stand, straightening already straight menus with surgical precision. Yes, Raymond, Kathleen responded, her voice carefully neutral. She lifted a tray of water glasses, deliberately ignoring the sharp protest from her lower back. She'd been standing, walking, bending, smiling for 10 hours straight. Her shoes, discount non-slips from a big box store in the suburbs, were splitting at the seams, held together by determination and a prayer. Kathleen Perry was 24 years old. To the clientele of the Azure, she existed as a function rather than a person. She was the hand that appeared when wine needed pouring, the voice that materialized to recite the evening's specials with choreographed enthusiasm, the convenient recipient of their frustrations when the kitchen ran behind schedule. They didn't notice the slight tremor in her hands when she was particularly exhausted. They couldn't have known that 18 months earlier, Kathleen had been presenting her thesis research on sociolinguistic patterns in East Asian business dialects at a national conference, fielding offers from 3 different graduate programs, being courted by the kind of academic advisors who could shape careers. Then came the diagnosis. Her brother Dion, 15 years old, kidney failure, stage 4. The transplant list, the specialist consultations, the insurance denials. Her scholarship covered tuition, not catastrophic medical emergencies. She'd withdrawn from her master's program mid-semester. She'd traded the seminar room for the dining room, linguistic theory for, can I get you anything else this evening? She did what survival demanded. Perry, Castellano's voice cut through her thoughts. High priority table, table 5, don't embarrass us. Kathleen looked toward the entrance. The hostess, a nervous young woman named Brianna, was executing an overly formal bow as a couple made their entrance. The man entered first, which told Kathleen's trained observational eye everything she needed to decode about the power dynamic that would follow. He was lean and athletic, dressed in an electric blue suit that probably cost more than 3 months of Kathleen's rent. The cut was impeccable, tailored to emphasize the sharp lines of his build. But it was his face that revealed his true nature, handsome in a calculated way, But there was something predatory in how his eyes swept the restaurant, cataloging who was present, who was watching, establishing the hierarchy before he'd even taken his seat. This was a man who measured his worth by how many people he could make feel small. This was Chu Yonghee. Kathleen had seen his name on reservation lists before, usually accompanied by notes from management. VIP, accommodate all requests, charges to platinum card, no questions. Behind him walked a woman who looked as though she regretted every decision that had led to this moment. She was striking, wearing a crimson dress that should have radiated confidence, but her body language told a different story entirely. Her shoulders were drawn inward, her smile forced, her eyes darting toward the exit as if calculating escape routes. This was Hannah, though Kathleen didn't yet know her name. Whatever relationship existed between these two people, one thing was evident. Hannah wasn't here by enthusiastic choice. "Right this way, Mr. Chu," Brianna said, her voice barely above a whisper. Chu didn't acknowledge her existence. He strode toward table 5, the restaurant's showpiece position, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's glittering skyline, and sat down with the territorial confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. He spread his arms across the back of the booth, claiming not just his space but everyone else's. Kathleen inhaled slowly, deliberately. She straightened her posture, smoothed her apron with hands that had learned to stay steady through countless indignities. Just get through the shift, she told herself, the mantra that had carried her through 6 months of this particular purgatory. Dion's dialysis appointment is Monday. The payment is due tomorrow. You can survive anything for 6 more hours. She walked toward table 5, her expression arranged into the mask of pleasant, unthreatening competence she'd perfected, the armor that allowed her to absorb their condescension without shattering. "Good evening," Kathleen said, her voice soft, professional, and carefully empty of anything that might be mistaken for personality. The alley behind the Azure smelled like every restaurant alley in America, grease traps, cigarette smoke, and the particular sourness of food waste fermenting in industrial dumpsters. Kathleen Perry stood with her back pressed against the brick wall, one foot propped up to relieve the pressure on her aching arches, a stack of handmade flashcards balanced in her palm. She flipped the card, studying the Korean characters, her lips moving soundlessly as she formed the shapes of the honorifics, feeling where her tongue needed to press against her palate to get the intonation precisely right. The translation on the back read, "Learning Korean requires dedication." She had 17 minutes before her shift started. 17 minutes to reinforce the neural pathways she was terrified of losing, to maintain the fluency she'd spent 6 years building, to remind herself that she was more than the uniform she was about to put on. The flashcards were remnants from her graduate work, though most of them she'd made in the past few months. Index cards purchased from a dollar store, filled with her cramped handwriting during the few quiet moments she could steal. Grammatical constructions, regional dialect variations, business terminology, slang from different provinces. The kind of linguistic precision that had once earned her academic accolades and now served only as a private rebellion against her circumstances. Kathleen had discovered her gift for languages by accident. She'd been 11 years old, sitting in the public library on Chicago's South Side while her mother worked a double shift at the hospital. She'd picked up a book on Japanese simply because the cover looked interesting, and something in her brain had clicked into place. The patterns, the structures, the way meaning could shift with a single particle or honorific. It was like music, except she could actually understand it. By 13. She was teaching herself Mandarin from YouTube videos. By 16, she'd added Korean, drawn initially by K-dramas her mother watched to decompress, then captivated by the language's complexity, its layers of formality, the way respect and hierarchy were encoded into every syllable. Her mother used to joke that Kathleen had been given a gift that would take her anywhere in the world. The irony wasn't lost on Kathleen that this gift, which had once promised escape, now kept her trapped in a kitchen alley, studying between shifts to keep her mind from atrophying completely. She studied another card, reviewing the rougher consonants of the Busan dialect, the way the speech patterns differed from Seoul's more refined standard. This was the kind of detail that separated adequate translators from exceptional ones, the nuance that had made her thesis advisors call her once in a generation. "Kathleen, you're on in 5. The voice belonged to Miguel, one of the line cooks, calling through the propped-open kitchen door. She waved acknowledgement without looking up, flipping through 3 more cards with practiced speed. Her brain absorbed the information the way other people breathed, automatically, completely, as though she'd been designed specifically for this purpose. She thought about Dion then, because she always thought about Dion during these stolen moments of intellectual exercise. Her little brother, who used to sit on her bed while she practiced pronunciation, laughing at the sounds she made, asking her to teach him curse words in different languages because that's what 14-year-old boys found hilarious. Dion, who'd collapsed during basketball practice 8 months ago and hadn't been the same since. Dion, whose body was betraying him in ways that medical science could fix if they could just afford the fixing. The transplant evaluation alone had cost $12,000. The surgery, when they finally found a match, would cost nearly $400,000. Their insurance, the catastrophic-only plan that was all her mother's job provided, covered approximately 30%, and only after they met a deductible that might as well have been written in scientific notation. The payment plans the hospital offered were designed for people with steady middle-class incomes, not for families where the primary breadwinner was a nursing assistant, and the second earner was a former graduate student slinging Korean fusion to people who treated her like furniture. Kathleen pocketed the flashcards and pulled out her phone. She had one text from her mother, sent 3 hours earlier. Dion's counts are stable. Try not to worry. I love you. As if not worrying were possible. As if she could compartmentalize the knowledge that her brother's kidneys were operating at less than 15% capacity, that he was exhausted all the time now, that the dialysis treatments left him so drained he could barely make it through a school day. She typed back, "Good. I'll stop by tomorrow before work. Love you both." Then she switched to her banking app, a masochistic ritual she performed before every shift. Checking account, $1,247.83. Savings account, $89.12. Credit card debt, $6,450, most of it medical expenses they'd had to charge because the alternative was letting Dion go without his medications. The math was brutal and unforgiving. She earned roughly $2,000 a month from the Azure, minimum wage plus tips, and the tips were inconsistent because people who spent $300 on dinner often felt that 15% was admirably generous. Her rent was $1,100 for a studio apartment she shared with her mother and Dion, crammed into a neighborhood where the sirens provided a consistent soundtrack. Utilities, transportation, food. She'd become an expert at the mathematics of poverty, calculating down to the dollar how much she could spend on groceries without shortchanging the medical payment plan. She'd done the projections. At her current earning rate, assuming no unexpected expenses and assuming Dion's condition didn't deteriorate, she might have saved enough for the transplant surgery in 4 years. 4 years of dialysis. 4 years of watching her brilliant, funny, basketball-obsessed little brother's life narrowed down to treatment schedules and dietary restrictions. 4 years of watching their mother age a decade. 4 years of her own life suspended in this purgatory, her mind slowly going dull from disuse, her potential evaporating like water on hot pavement. She'd applied for grants, scholarships, medical assistance programs. She'd filled out forms until her hand cramped, made phone calls to bureaucrats who expressed sympathy and approved nothing. The system wasn't designed for people like them, too poor for private solutions, not poor enough for the limited public assistance that existed. They lived in the gap, and the gap was where people fell through. Kathleen pushed off the wall and headed toward the kitchen entrance. The moment she stepped through that door, she would need to transform. The woman who understood the sociolinguistic implications of speech register shifts in hierarchical Asian cultures would disappear. In her place would stand a waitress, pleasant, accommodating, invisible. She developed the technique over 6 months, what she privately called the invisible wall. It was a form of disassociation, really, a psychological trick that allowed her to separate her sense of self from the work her body was performing. When customers spoke to her rudely, when they snapped their fingers or called her girl despite her name tag, when they modified their orders 4 times, and then blamed her for the kitchen's confusion, none of it touched the real Kathleen Perry. That woman was safely locked away somewhere behind bulletproof glass, observing but not experiencing, present but protected. The invisible wall was what allowed her to smile when a customer complained that she'd taken too long to refill water, even though she'd been helping another table. It was what kept her voice steady when men old enough to be her father made comments about her appearance, their wives sitting right there, everyone pretending it was just harmless joking. It was how she'd survived being called articulate, in that particular tone white people used when they were surprised a black woman could form complete sentences, or being asked, "Where are you really from?" by customers who couldn't fathom that a waitress might have depth beyond her job description. She understood what they saw when they looked at her, a young black woman in a server's uniform, a role so firmly fixed in the American imagination that they never looked past it. They didn't see the undergraduate degree earned with a full scholarship, the graduate coursework, the research that had been on track to revolutionize how businesses approached cross-cultural communication. They saw the uniform, and the uniform told them everything they needed to know. She was there to serve. She was there to absorb their demands. She was replaceable, forgettable, beneath notice. The invisible wall protected her from the rage that would otherwise consume her, rage at the unfairness, at the waste of her abilities, at the way America promised that intelligence and hard work would be rewarded while simultaneously ensuring that people without family wealth spent their lives treading water. She couldn't afford rage. Rage didn't pay for dialysis. Rage didn't keep them from eviction. So she built the wall, and she kept it reinforced, and she survived. Kathleen pushed through the kitchen door into the organized chaos of dinner service. The heat hit her immediately, radiating from the line where 5 cooks worked with choreographed intensity. The head chef, a temperamental man named David Cho who'd trained in Seoul and never let anyone forget it, was barking orders in a mixture of English and Korean that none of his staff understood. The expeditor was plating dishes with artistic precision that would be destroyed in 30 seconds by the customers who Instagrammed their food before eating it. The dishwasher, an older Mexican man named Tomás, who was the kindest person on staff, caught her eye and nodded greeting. She grabbed her server's apron from the hook, black, starched, with pockets deep enough to hold order pads, pens, wine keys, and the emotional armor necessary for the performance ahead. She tied it with practiced efficiency, feeling the transformation complete itself. Graduate student Kathleen, linguistics prodigy Kathleen, the woman who dreamed in 3 languages and could hear the class implications in every vowel shift, that person receded. In her place stood a waitress, ready to smile on command, ready to accommodate any request, ready to be whatever these people needed her to be for the next 8 hours. Raymond Castellano appeared, clipboard in hand, his perpetually stressed expression suggesting he was single-handedly preventing the restaurant's collapse through sheer force of managerial will. "Perry, you've got Section 2 tonight, tables 4 through 8. We've got a VIP at 5, reservation under 2. He's..." Raymond paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's particular. Don't engage in unnecessary conversation. Be efficient, be invisible. Understood." "Understood," Kathleen said, her voice adopting the carefully neutral tone that conveyed competence without personality. "And Perry," Raymond's voice dropped slightly, "I know the tips in Section 2 can be inconsistent, but I need you there. You don't react to difficult customers. Some of the other servers..." He trailed off, but Kathleen understood. Some of the other servers had self-respect, had boundaries, had the economic stability to risk standing up for themselves. Kathleen had a brother on dialysis and $1,700 until rent was due. She had the invisible wall. "I'll take care of it," she said and meant it. She checked her reflection in the steel surface of the industrial refrigerator, hair pulled back into a neat bun, minimal makeup, because anything more elaborate would be gone by the end of the shift anyway, expression carefully pleasant. She looked professional, competent, and completely unremarkable. Perfect. Kathleen picked up her order pad and stepped through the door into the dining room, into the soft lighting and quiet luxury, into the world where she was invisible by design and necessity. The invisible wall clicked into place. She was ready for whatever the next 8 hours would bring, or at least, she thought she was. She had no idea that at table 5, a man in a blue suit was about to make the mistake of his life. The dining room of the Azure existed in a state of carefully manufactured perfection. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the western wall, offering a panoramic view of Chicago's downtown skyline as it transitioned from the golden hour into evening twilight. The interior designer had chosen a palette meant to evoke both modern minimalism and traditional Korean aesthetics. Dark wood tables with clean lines, accent walls featuring textured stone, pendant lights that hung like frozen drops of water, and strategic pops of color in the form of contemporary art pieces that probably cost more than Kathleen's annual salary. The ceiling soared overhead, crossed by exposed beams that had been treated to look like aged timber, though the building was only 3 years old. Everything was calculated to convey understated luxury, the kind of environment where the wealthy could feel simultaneously pampered and culturally sophisticated. Kathleen was refilling water glasses at table 7 when she heard the shift in energy near the entrance. It was subtle, the kind of atmospheric change that came from someone entering a space with the expectation that their presence alone demanded attention. She glanced up from her task, trained by 6 months of service work to identify potential complications before they reached her section. The door opened, and Chu Yonghee walked in. He moved with the kind of confidence that came not from genuine self-assurance, but from never having been meaningfully challenged. His posture was aggressive in its casual nature, shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, his gait suggesting he was permanently on the verge of being photographed. He was in his early 30s, Korean, with the kind of build that spoke of expensive gym memberships and possibly chemical enhancement. His black hair was styled with precision, swept back from his forehead with enough product to survive a moderate windstorm, cut close on the sides in a style that was currently fashionable among men who confused money with taste. But it was the suit that announced his intentions before he'd spoken a word. Electric blue, not navy, not royal, but a shade so vivid it almost hummed. The fabric caught the restaurant's ambient lighting and transformed it into something that demanded to be noticed. It was tailored within an inch of its life, fitted so precisely across his shoulders and chest that it looked painted on, the jacket buttoned despite the fact that he was indoors and no longer needed the formality. The pants broke perfectly over what were clearly custom dress shoes, polished to a mirror finish. A pocket square in a slightly darker blue provided the only variation in the monochromatic assault. His shirt was crisp white, open at the collar to reveal a heavy gold chain that probably violated several principles of good taste, but accurately conveyed its wearer's relationship with wealth. He had it, and he needed you to know. On his wrist sat a watch that could have funded Dion's surgery twice over. Kathleen recognized it even from across the room, a diamond-encrusted timepiece that wasn't just expensive, but aggressively so, the kind of accessory that served no purpose beyond announcing that its owner had more money than sense. The diamonds caught the light with every movement, sending tiny rainbows across nearby surfaces like a disco ball in miniature. Trailing behind Chu, moving with considerably less confidence, was his date. She was a study in contrasts. Where Chu announced himself, she seemed to be attempting to disappear. The woman was young, possibly younger than Kathleen, with delicate features and the kind of beauty that would have been striking if it weren't currently overshadowed by obvious discomfort. Her blonde hair fell in carefully styled waves around her shoulders, and her makeup was flawless in the way that suggested professional application. But her eyes kept darting around the restaurant with the trapped energy of someone calculating exit routes. Her dress was the color of fresh blood, a deep, saturated red that hugged her figure in a way that was clearly intentional but seemed to make her deeply uncomfortable. It was designer, probably chosen by Chu rather than selected by her, the kind of garment that looked expensive first and flattering second. The neckline was modest, but the fit left little to interpretation. She wore heels that added 3 inches to her height and probably subtracted considerably from her ability to run if necessary. Her hands kept moving to adjust the dress, pulling it down at the hem, checking the neckline, fidgeting with the thin strap on her shoulder, small, unconscious gestures that revealed her discomfort with being so visibly on display. She carried a clutch that matched the dress, held against her body like a small shield. Her jewelry was minimal, small diamond earrings, no necklace, which suggested either personal preference or that Chu's taste in accessories was reserved exclusively for himself. There was something in her body language, a tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that reminded Kathleen of prey animals in nature documentaries, the way they held perfectly still while predators circled, hopping invisibility might equal safety. Brianna, the young hostess, had intercepted them at the entrance. She was new, maybe 3 weeks into the job, still operating under the naive assumption that politeness would be reciprocated. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying the rehearsed brightness of someone who'd been told that enthusiasm was a job requirement. "Welcome to the Azure. Do you have a reservation?" Chu didn't look at her. His eyes were scanning the dining room, cataloging the other patrons, assessing the audience for whatever performance he was planning. "Chu," he said, the single syllable delivered with the expectation of immediate recognition. "Table for 2. I called 3 hours ago and specified my requirements." "Of course, Mr. Chu," Brianna said, checking her tablet with fumbling fingers. "I have you right here, if you'll just follow me." "Where's the table?" Chu interrupted, still not making eye contact with her. He'd identified someone he wanted to see him, a table near the center of the room where 3 men in expensive suits were deep in conversation, and was already plotting his trajectory. "Table 5, sir," Brianna said, gesturing toward the window. "Our premiere." "That's acceptable," Chu said, as if he'd been presented with options and had graciously selected one. He started walking before Brianna could finish her sentence, forcing her to scurry ahead of him to maintain the fiction that she was leading rather than chasing. His date followed behind, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that somehow managed to sound apologetic. Kathleen watched this procession from her position at table 7, her hands continuing their automatic task of water service, while her mind cataloged everything she was observing. She'd waited on enough difficult customers to recognize the type, men who confused rudeness with power, who believed that treating service workers with contempt somehow elevated their own status. She saw how he walked slightly ahead of his date, never checking to see if she was keeping pace, never holding a door or offering his arm. She noticed how his eyes kept sliding across the room, checking to see who was watching him, feeding on attention like it was oxygen. They reached table 5, and Chu stopped abruptly, causing his date to nearly collide with him. He surveyed the table's setup with the critical eye of someone determined to find fault. The table was perfect, of course. The Azure's front-of-house staff were terrified of Raymond's wrath, but Chu's expression suggested he was disappointed not to have found something to complain about. The table sat in the corner with windows on 2 sides, offering views of both the city skyline and the street below. The linens were crisp, the silverware gleamed, a small arrangement of orchids provided the centerpiece. 2 leather-bound menus sat waiting, along with the wine list presented in its own elegant folder. Brianna pulled out a chair for the woman in red, but Chu had already sat down, claiming the power position, back to the wall view of the entire restaurant, positioned so anyone entering would see him immediately. His date hesitated, then seated herself in the remaining chair, the one that faced the window, her back to most of the room. Chu adjusted his jacket, tugged his cuffs to ensure the watch was visible, and spread his arms across the back of the booth, claiming territory that extended well beyond his actual physical space. "Water," he said to Brianna, the word delivered not as a request but as a command. "Imported, not tap, and bring me your wine list, the actual wine list, not whatever simplified version you show to people who don't know the difference." "The wine list is already on your table, sir," Brianna said, her brightness wavering slightly. She gestured to the leather folder. Chu glanced at it as if noticing it for the first time, but made no move to acknowledge his error. "We need time before ordering," he said. "Tell your waitress not to hover. I'll signal when we're ready." "Of course, sir. Your server will be Kathleen, and she'll be right with you." Brianna retreated, her professional smile cracking slightly as she turned away, her eyes finding Kathleen's across the room with an expression of sympathetic warning. From her position at table 7, Kathleen observed Chu settling into his chosen throne. He'd pulled out his phone, the screen reflecting off his face in the dimmed lighting, and was scrolling through something with a kind of aggressive finger movements that suggested he was performing even this mundane action for an invisible audience. His date sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. Chu leaned back in his chair, the motion causing his jacket to pull tight across his chest, probably intentional. He said something to his date. Kathleen was too far away to hear the words, but she could read the body language. The woman in red nodded slightly, her lips barely moving in response, her hands twisting together in her lap. Whatever he'd said, it hadn't been kind. Kathleen recognized that particular kind of public humiliation, the quiet cruelty that people inflicted on their companions in restaurants, using the public setting as both weapon and shield, knowing their victims couldn't respond without causing a scene. Kathleen finished her task at table 7 and moved to collect the empty appetizer plates from table 4, her path taking her closer to table 5. She kept her expression neutral, her movements efficient, but her observational skills, honed by years of academic research into human behavior and communication, were recording everything. The way Chu kept checking his reflection in the window. The way his date's shoulders had hunched inward, making herself smaller. The way his voice, when he spoke to her, had a particular edge to it, the tone of someone who enjoyed having power over another person. Raymond materialized at Kathleen's elbow, his clipboard clutched like a religious artifact. "That's your table," he said quietly, tilting his head minutely toward table 5. "He's called ahead 3 times today. He wants everything perfect. Don't give him any reason to complain." "Understood," Kathleen said, balancing the plates she'd collected with practiced ease. "I mean it, Perry. Some customers—" Raymond paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. "Some customers come here looking for an experience. Others come looking for an excuse to make someone feel small. This one's the second type. Don't take the bait." Kathleen nodded. The invisible wall was already rising, that psychological barrier that would allow her to absorb whatever was coming without letting it damage the parts of herself she needed to protect. She deposited the dirty plates in the service station, pulled out her order pad, checked that her apron was straight, and fixed her expression into the mask of pleasant professional competence that the job required. She could see Chu from across the room, holding court at his window table, master of his small kingdom. His date had pulled out her phone, probably desperate for any distraction from her companion's presence. The electric blue suit seemed to glow in the ambient lighting, a beacon announcing its wearer's presence to everyone in the establishment. Kathleen took a breath, activated the invisible wall, and started walking toward table 5, her posture perfect, her expression serene, ready to deliver the performance that survival required. She had no idea that the man in the blue suit had already decided she was beneath contempt, that he'd planned an elaborate humiliation, or that his arrogance was about to collide with her brilliance in a way that would change both their lives forever. Kathleen crossed the dining room with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to make herself unobtrusive. Her shoes made almost no sound against the hardwood floor, a skill she'd developed deliberately. Quiet footsteps meant she could approach tables without startling diners mid-conversation, could refill water glasses without interrupting the flow of business deals or romantic dinners. Invisibility had its techniques, its practiced choreography. Table 5 sat bathed in the amber glow of the setting sun filtering through the western windows. The light caught the diamond-encrusted watch on Chu Yonghee's wrist, sending fractured rainbows across the white tablecloth. He was leaning back in his chair with the posture of someone who never had to worry about taking up too much space, his phone still in hand, thumbs scrolling with aggressive swipes. His date, the woman in the crimson dress, had her own phone out now, but her grip on it looked more defensive than engaged, as if she were using it as a barrier between herself and her companion, rather than for any genuine purpose. Kathleen stopped at the appropriate distance, close enough to indicate her presence but not so close as to invade their space. She'd learned the geometry of service, the invisible boundaries that separated help from intrusion. "Good evening," she said, her voice pitched at the level of professional warmth that conveyed attentiveness without familiarity. "My name is Kathleen, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I start you off with something to drink, or would you like a few more minutes to look over the menu?" Chu didn't look up. His eyes remained fixed on his phone's screen, his thumb continuing its aggressive scrolling. The seconds stretched out, each one adding weight to the deliberate dismissal. Kathleen maintained her pleasant expression, her order pad ready, her posture patient. This wasn't the first time a customer had made her wait, though the power dynamics of the situation were always the same. They had the right to her time, but she had no claim on theirs. Finally, without lifting his gaze from his phone, Chu spoke. But the language that came out of his mouth wasn't English. The Korean flowed from him in a casual stream. the particular Seoul dialect that marked him as someone who either came from or wanted to be associated with the capital's elite circles. His tone was conversational, almost lazy, the way someone might comment on the weather or the traffic. Kathleen's linguistic training, those 6 years of intensive study, and the natural gift that had made that study feel less like work and more like breathing, allowed her to parse every syllable with perfect clarity. "Look at this one," Chu said to his date, still not making eye contact with Kathleen. "She's standing there like a statue. How long do these people need before they understand basic instructions? I said we needed time." The woman in red shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her name, Kathleen would later learn, was Hannah. She glanced up at Kathleen with an expression that contained equal parts embarrassment and something that might have been apology, though not enough apology to actually intervene. "Young-hee," she said quietly, her own Korean carrying a different accent, possibly Busan based on the vowel shapes. "She just got here." Chu waved his hand dismissively, the gesture made more elaborate by the weight of the watch. "They're all the same in these places. They hire them for their looks and then act surprised when they can't think." He finally looked up at Kathleen, and his eyes performed a slow, deliberate scan from her face down to her shoes and back up again. The assessment was clinical, dehumanizing, the way someone might examine a piece of furniture they were considering purchasing. "This one isn't even pretty enough for that excuse. Look at her shoes, those things are falling apart. And the hair, she looks like she just rolled out of bed." Kathleen's expression didn't change. The invisible wall was functioning exactly as designed, creating a barrier between the words being spoken and the woman hearing them. Her training told her that he was using the informal register, the kind of Korean you'd use with children or people you considered beneath you. The linguistic disrespect was as deliberate as the content of his words. Her face remained pleasantly neutral, her order pad still poised, her body language suggesting patient attentiveness rather than comprehension. Hannah laughed, but the sound came out wrong, too high, too brief, strangled by discomfort. It was the laugh of someone who knew they were witnessing cruelty but lacked either the courage or the power to stop it. "You shouldn't say things like that," she murmured, but her voice barely carried across the table, and there was no real conviction in the words. She was performing objection rather than embodying it. "Why not?" Chu's mouth curved into something that resembled a smile but contained no warmth. "It's not like she understands. Americans are all the same. They think the world revolves around English. They can barely speak their own language properly, let alone anyone else's." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone that was still perfectly audible to Kathleen. "I could tell her exactly what I think of her and this pathetic excuse for a restaurant, and she'd just stand there with that stupid smile, nodding like a trained dog." The words hung in the air between them, invisible to everyone except Kathleen and the two people who'd spoken them. To any observer watching from another table, the scene would have appeared utterly mundane, a server waiting patiently while customers finished their conversation before ordering. The violence of the interaction was confined entirely to language, which made it perfect for someone like Chu, who understood that certain kinds of cruelty could be conducted in broad daylight as long as you spoke the right code. Kathleen's mind was working on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, she maintained the performance of polite incomprehension, her face a mask of professional patience. But beneath that surface, her linguistic training was automatically analyzing everything she heard. She identified the Seoul dialect's particular characteristics, the way certain vowels were pronounced, the specific verb endings Chu chose, the social register he was using that marked her as someone unworthy of even basic courtesy. She noted Hannah's different accent, the way her Korean carried the rougher consonants and different intonation patterns of the southeastern coast. She observed how Chu's language became more crude as he continued, how he was performing his disdain not just for Kathleen, but for Hannah as well, demonstrating his power over both women through different means. The academic part of her brain, the part that had written a 30-page thesis on power dynamics in multilingual business settings, found the whole display fascinating in its textbook clarity. Chu was using language as a weapon of exclusion, creating an in-group of two people who shared linguistic knowledge, and using that knowledge to dehumanize a third person standing right in front of them. It was a classic dominance display, the kind of behavior she'd studied in theory and was now experiencing in practice. The human part of her brain, the part that existed behind the invisible wall, registered the words differently. Ugly. Slow. Stupid. These weren't new insults. She'd heard variations throughout her life, the particular ways that black women's appearance and intelligence were casually dismissed. But hearing them delivered with such casual cruelty while she was required to stand there and smile added a particular flavor of humiliation to the experience. Chu was warming to his subject now, encouraged by Hana's nervous laughter and Kathleen's apparent incomprehension. Look at her just standing there, he continued, his Korean flowing easily now. Probably can't even count to 10 without using her fingers. These service jobs are perfect for people like her. No thinking required, just smile and carry plates. Even that seems to be challenging, based on how long she's taking. Hana glanced at Kathleen again, and this time there was something more complex in her expression. Guilt, perhaps, or recognition of her own complicity in what was happening. But she didn't speak up. Instead, she took a sip of the water that had been preset on the table, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted the glass. You know what the funniest part is? Chu leaned back again, his voice taking on the satisfied tone of someone who believed he was being particularly clever. Americans always talk about being so advanced, so civilized, but they can't be bothered to learn any language except their own. They expect the whole world to accommodate them, to speak English everywhere they go. And then they act confused when the rest of us talk about them right in front of their faces. It's like having conversations around a particularly stupid dog. You know it can't understand, so you can say whatever you want. He picked up the wine list, making a show of examining it while continuing his monologue. I could order in Korean, make her run back and forth to the kitchen trying to figure out what I'm saying, watch her get more and more confused. That might actually be entertaining. Better than listening to her butcher the specials with that accent. Kathleen remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. The order pad in her hand hadn't moved. Her posture suggested she was simply waiting patiently for them to finish their conversation and turn their attention to ordering, a well-trained server who knew not to interrupt customers mid-discussion. Anyone watching from a distance would see nothing unusual in the tableau, just another table where the diners were taking their time deciding what to order. But Kathleen's heart was beating faster now, her body responding to the stress even as her face refused to show it. The invisible wall was doing its job, containing the emotional response that would have been natural, appropriate, human. Behind that wall, she was simultaneously translating, analyzing, and feeling 3 parallel processes running at different speeds. The translator in her noted the grammar, the vocabulary choices, the social implications of his register. The analyst in her recognized the pathology of his behavior, the deep insecurity that required him to diminish others to feel elevated. The human in her felt the sting of every word, even as she refused to let that sting show on her face. This was what survival looked like. This was what it meant to need a job so desperately that you stood still, while someone dehumanized you in a language they assumed you didn't speak. This was what it meant to have a brother whose life depended on your ability to endure humiliation without response. The invisible wall wasn't just psychological protection. It was economic necessity, the barrier between employment and unemployment, between paying the rent and eviction, between Dion's dialysis treatments and medical crisis. Chu finally looked directly at Kathleen, his eyes making contact for the first time since she'd approached the table. His expression was one of performative impatience, as if she'd been the one keeping him waiting rather than the other way around. He spoke in English now, his words slow and loud, the way people often spoke to those they assumed were intellectually limited. We need more time. Come back later. Each word was separated by a pause, as if the spaces between them would somehow enhance comprehension. His tone suggested he was doing her a favor by communicating at all, that even this basic interaction was more effort than she deserved. Kathleen nodded, her smile remaining professional and pleasant. Of course, she said, her voice steady and warm, giving no indication that she'd understood every word of the preceding conversation. I'll give you a few more minutes to look over the menu. Just wave when you're ready, and I'll be right over. She turned to leave, her movements smooth and unhurried, maintaining the performance to perfection. As she walked away, she heard Chu's voice again, speaking in Korean to Hana. See, completely oblivious. Like I said, trained dog. Hana's uncomfortable laugh followed Kathleen across the dining room. Chu treats people like dirt just because he has money. If you think everyone deserves respect regardless of their job, hit the like button to prove him wrong. Kathleen made it back to the service station before allowing herself a single, slow breath. Her hands were steady as she set down her order pad. Her expression remained neutral, professional. But behind the invisible wall, in the private space where her true self still existed, she was making calculations. She was remembering every word Chu had spoken, filing away the information with the precision her linguistic training had instilled. She didn't know yet how this encounter would resolve, didn't know that she was standing at the edge of a moment that would change everything. For now, she simply straightened her apron, picked up a water pitcher, and prepared to continue her shift. The invisible wall held firm. She would survive this, the way she'd survived everything else. She always did. Kathleen stayed away from table 5 for exactly 7 minutes, a duration she calculated would seem appropriately respectful of their request for time without appearing neglectful. She spent those minutes attending to her other tables, refilling a bread basket at table 4, clearing appetizer plates from table 6, answering a question about gluten-free options for an anxious diner at table 8. The routine tasks allowed her hands to stay busy while her mind processed what had just occurred. She'd been called worse things in her life. The particular intersection of being black and female in America meant she'd accumulated an entire catalog of insults. Some whispered behind hands, others shouted from passing cars, still others delivered with the kind of polite racism that hid contempt behind concern. But there was something particularly corrosive about being dehumanized in a language the speaker assumed you didn't understand. It was like being forced to witness your own erasure, to stand present while someone discussed your absence. The invisible wall held, though. It always did. That was its purpose. She glanced across the dining room toward table 5. Chu was gesturing animatedly now, his phone finally put away, his attention focused on Hana. The woman in red was leaning back slightly, her body language defensive, but she was listening. Chu's expression had shifted from casual disdain to something more animated, almost excited. Whatever he was saying to her now was different from the lazy cruelty of his earlier commentary. There was energy in his movements, purpose in his posture. Raymond appeared at Kathleen's elbow, his clipboard absent for once, replaced by a wine bottle he was examining with the intensity of someone reading encrypted intelligence. "Table 5 flagged me down," he said quietly. "They're ready to order. The gentleman was very specific that he wanted you, not one of the other servers." His tone suggested this was not good news. "Understood," Kathleen said, setting down the water pitcher she'd been holding. She pulled out her order pad, checked that her pen was working, and smoothed her apron one more time, small rituals that helped activate the performance mode she needed. "Perry," Raymond's voice stopped her before she could move. "Whatever he says, whatever he asks for, just accommodate it. We can't afford complaints from customers like him. He knows people." The unspoken message was clear. Chu Yonghee was someone whose displeasure could have consequences beyond a single bad review. In the ecosystem of high-end dining, there were customers whose opinions carried weight, whose social media posts could damage reputations, whose complaints to ownership could end careers. Raymond's job security depended on keeping such people satisfied, which meant Kathleen's job security depended on absorbing whatever treatment those people chose to deliver. "I'll take care of it," Kathleen said, and meant it in ways Raymond couldn't possibly understand. She crossed the dining room again, her pace measured, her expression set to its default mode of professional pleasantness. As she approached table 5, she could see that something had shifted in the dynamic between Chu and Hana. The woman in red was shaking her head slightly, her mouth forming words that looked like objections, but her protest lacked conviction. Chu was grinning now, an expression that contained genuine amusement rather than his earlier performative superiority. He'd pulled out his wallet, expensive leather, probably Italian, and was removing what looked like a significant amount of cash. Kathleen stopped at the appropriate distance from the table. "Good evening again," she said, her voice carrying the same warm professionalism as before, as if the earlier interaction had never occurred. "Have you had a chance to decide, or can I answer any questions about our menu?" Chu looked up at her, and his grin widened. He said something in Korean to Hana, too quickly for Kathleen to catch all the words, but she heard, "Watch this," clearly enough. Then he turned his attention fully to Kathleen, and his expression shifted into something that was almost friendly, which somehow felt more dangerous than his earlier disdain. "Actually," he said in English, drawing out the word, "my companion and I were just discussing the menu, and we've noticed something interesting." He gestured to the leather-bound menu in front of him. "This is supposed to be a premier Korean fusion establishment, correct?" "That's correct," Kathleen said, her pen poised over her order pad. "And yet," Chu continued, his tone suggesting he was building toward something, "the menu seems somewhat limited in its scope. Rather pedestrian, if I'm being honest. Galbi, bulgogi, bibimbap, very standard. The kind of dishes you'd find at any Korean restaurant in any American city." He paused, letting his criticism settle. "Where's the authenticity? Where's the real Korean cuisine?" Kathleen maintained her pleasant expression. This was a trap, clearly, though she couldn't yet see its full dimensions. "Our chef, David Cho, trained in Seoul under Master Kim Sung-min," she said, delivering information she'd memorized from the restaurant's marketing materials. "He specializes in modern interpretations of traditional dishes, focusing on seasonal ingredients and—" "Modern interpretations," Chu interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "That's code for Americanized, isn't it? Watered down for palates that can't handle real Korean food." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Here's what I want. I want to see if your kitchen can actually handle authentic Korean preparation, or if this whole establishment is just an expensive fraud." He switched to Korean then, and the dialect that came out of his mouth was dramatically different from what he'd been speaking earlier. The Seoul accent vanished, replaced by something rougher, more aggressive. Kathleen's trained ear immediately identified it as Busan dialect, but not the standard form. This was the particular variant spoken in the markets and docks, heavily laden with local slang and colloquialisms that even many Korean speakers would struggle to follow. It was the linguistic equivalent of someone switching from received pronunciation British English to the thickest Scottish brogue, then throwing in regional idioms for good measure. The words came rapid fire. "I want bok jip-style prepared blowfish, not the safe frozen cuts you probably have in the back. I want it served the traditional way, paper-thin slices arranged chrysanthemum style on a chilled plate, with the liver prepared separately, just lightly blanched, none of this Western overcooking. The sauce should be chajang mixed with citron, heavy on the gochugaru, and I want it served with raw scallions cut against the grain, not those useless decorative pieces you probably put on everything. The fish needs to come from the waters off Jeju Island, and it needs to be male, harvested in winter. And I want Sam leaves on the side, proper perilla leaves, not whatever substitution your kitchen thinks passes for Korean vegetables." He paused, his eyes locked on Kathleen's face, watching for any sign of comprehension. When her expression remained neutrally pleasant, he continued, his Korean becoming even more colloquial, throwing in slang terms that wouldn't be found in any textbook. "And make sure the knife work is proper, none of this thick-cut garbage. The slices should be thin enough to see through when you hold them up to light. If your chef doesn't know what I'm talking about, then he's a fraud and this restaurant is a joke, just like I suspected." Kathleen stood perfectly still, her order pad ready, her expression politely attentive, but showing no indication that she'd understood a single word. The performance was flawless. She looked exactly like someone waiting patiently for a customer to finish speaking in a foreign language, so she could politely ask them to repeat it in English. Hana was staring at Chu with an expression that mixed horror and fascination. "Young-hee," she said quietly in Korean, "blowfish isn't even on the menu, and you know it's not." "That's exactly the point," Chu said, switching to English for Kathleen's presumed benefit, his grin returning. "I've just ordered a complex, traditional Korean dish that's not on the menu, in a dialect that's not standard Korean, using terminology that even most Korean speakers wouldn't know." He pulled out his phone and set it on the table between himself and Hana. "Here's the bet. I'm wagering $5,000 that she'll either have to admit she didn't understand a word I said, or she'll go back to the kitchen and completely butcher the order, and we'll get to watch this whole fancy operation fall apart trying to figure out what I actually wanted." He counted out 50 $100 bills from his wallet, making a show of arranging them in a neat stack on the table beside his phone. The diamonds in his watch caught the light as he moved, sending sparkles across the white tablecloth. Either way, we expose this place for what it really is, a pretentious fraud that hired people based on how they look rather than what they know. And as a bonus, we get to watch her squirm when the kitchen calls her back to admit she got everything wrong. Hannah was shaking her head, her discomfort now mixed with something that might have been genuine concern. "This is cruel," she said quietly. "You're setting her up to fail. She probably needs this job." "So do thousands of other people," Chu said dismissively. "If she can't handle the requirements of working in a Korean restaurant, she should find employment elsewhere. This is natural selection. The incompetent get weeded out, and someone more qualified takes their place. I'm actually doing her a favor, showing her she's in over her head before she wastes more time in a position she's not qualified for." He looked back up at Kathleen, who'd been standing through this entire exchange with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting while customers debated their orders. Her expression hadn't changed, still pleasantly professional, still ready to help, showing no reaction to the stack of money now sitting on the table or the conversation happening in front of her. Chu switched back to the heavy Busan dialect, adding more details to his order. "And make sure the fish is prepared no more than 30 minutes before serving, any longer and the texture's wrong. The presentation plate should be traditional ceramic, not those modern square plates you people seem to love. And I want the meals served in the proper sequence. The sliced fish first, then the liver preparation, then the vegetables. Not all at once like you're at some kind of buffet." He leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression one of satisfied anticipation. The trap was fully set now. Either Kathleen would have to admit she hadn't understood his order and ask him to repeat it in English, revealing her incompetence and giving him grounds to complain to management, or she would try to relay the order to the kitchen and inevitably get details wrong, leading to the same result. Either way, he won. Either way, she failed. The silence stretched out. The ambient noise of the restaurant continued around them, conversations at other tables, the soft clink of silverware against china, the muted sounds of the kitchen operating beyond the swinging doors. The sunset had progressed, the light through the windows deepening from gold to amber to the first hints of purple twilight. The city lights beyond the glass were beginning to assert themselves against the fatting day. Kathleen stood with her pen still poised over her order pad, the picture of professional readiness. Inside, behind the invisible wall, calculations were occurring at lightning speed. She was deciding, in real time, whether to continue the performance of incomprehension or to drop the mask entirely. She was weighing the satisfaction of revealing her comprehension against the potential consequences. She was measuring the $5,000 on the table against 6 months of accumulated humiliation, her brother's medical needs against her own dignity, survival against justice. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for her response. The moment stretched, suspended like a droplet of water hanging from a faucet in the instant before gravity claims it. Kathleen stood at the edge of table 5, her order pad still poised, her expression still arranged in that mask of professional pleasantness. Behind the invisible wall, a decision was crystallizing. 6 months. 6 months of swallowing insults, of making herself small, of accepting treatment that would have broken someone with less at stake. 6 months of standing silent while customers spoke about her as if she weren't human, as if she were simply a functional object placed in their environment for convenience. 6 months of the invisible wall doing its job, protecting her from the daily erosions of dignity that came with service work in an establishment where the customers measured their worth by how many people they could make feel worthless. But this was different. Chu Yonghee hadn't just been casually dismissive or thoughtlessly rude. He'd constructed an elaborate trap, invested $5,000 in humiliating her, created a spectacle designed specifically to expose what he assumed was her incompetence. He'd weaponized language itself, turned her area of expertise into what he believed would be the instrument of her professional destruction. And he'd done it all while believing she was too stupid to understand, too ignorant to recognize what was happening, too beneath his consideration to pose any kind of threat. He'd made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd assumed silence meant ignorance. He'd confused the performance of subservience with actual inferiority. He'd looked at her worn shoes and her waitress uniform and concluded that he knew everything worth knowing about who she was. Kathleen felt something shift inside her, like tectonic plates moving after years of pressure. The invisible wall had served its purpose, had kept her employed and her brother in treatment. But maintaining that wall required her to accept a fundamental lie about herself, that her brilliance didn't matter, that her years of study were irrelevant, that the gift she'd been born with had no value in the world she was forced to inhabit. She thought about Dion, about the dialysis treatments and the transplant fund that grew with agonizing slowness. She thought about her mother, working double shifts and pretending not to notice how much weight Kathleen had lost. She thought about the thesis she'd never finished, the career she'd abandoned, the future she'd traded for survival. And she thought about the man sitting in front of her, smirking with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for his cruelty, who genuinely believed that money and malice entitled him to treat other human beings as props in his personal theater. The decision made itself. Some moments demanded surrender, others demanded truth. Kathleen straightened her spine, a subtle shift in posture that transformed her presence entirely. Her shoulders rolled back, her chin lifted slightly, and something changed in her eyes, the mask of pleasant servility sliding away to reveal the intellect that had been hiding behind it. She looked directly at Chu Yonghee, meeting his eyes with a level gaze that contained no deference, no uncertainty, no trace of the subservient performance she'd been maintaining. When she spoke, the words came in Korean, not the standard dialect, not casual speech, but the high formal register known as Jeondae or Jeongeo. This was the language of presidential addresses, of academic conferences, of formal diplomatic exchange. It was Korean at its most elevated and respectful, every syllable carefully shaped, every verb ending precisely conjugated to convey the maximum possible respect and formality. Her pronunciation was flawless, her intonation perfect, carrying the educated soul accent that marked speakers of the highest social and educational status. "I understand perfectly, honored customer," Kathleen said, her Korean emerging with crystalline clarity. "You have requested blowfish prepared in the traditional Busan bokjip style, with the flesh sliced paper-thin in the chrysanthemum arrangement, pattern on a chilled traditional ceramic serving plate. You have specified that the fish should be male, harvested during winter months from the waters off Jeju Island, and that it must be prepared no more than 30 minutes prior to service to maintain optimal texture." She paused, her pen moving across her order pad with practiced efficiency, recording the order in a mixture of Korean characters and her own shorthand. Chu's expression had frozen mid-smirk, his mouth still slightly open, his eyes widening with something that hadn't yet resolved into any specific emotion. Hana had gone completely still, her water glass suspended halfway to her lips, forgotten. Kathleen continued, her formal Korean flowing with the ease of someone who'd spent years studying not just the language, but the cultural contexts that gave it meaning. "You have requested the liver prepared separately, lightly blanched rather than fully cooked in the Western style, served after the initial fish course to maintain the traditional sequence. The accompanying sauce should be chajang with citron, heavy concentration of chili pepper powder, served with raw scallions cut against the grain to release maximum flavor. You have also requested proper perilla leaves for wrapping, not substitutions." She looked up from her order pad, her expression now professional but no longer subservient. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. She was no longer a waitress speaking to a customer, but one expert addressing another, one person of education engaging with someone who'd revealed far more about themselves than they'd intended. "However, sir, I feel obligated to inform you of several complications with your order." Her Korean remained impeccably formal, the kind of language that conveyed respect while simultaneously establishing her own authority. "First, while our chef trained under Master Kim in Seoul and maintains excellent technique, we do not currently have blowfish on premise. Fugu requires specialized licensing due to the tetrodotoxin content, and our restaurant's permits do not extend to preparing potentially lethal ingredients. Even if we could legally serve it, the preparation time you've requested would be impossible given current kitchen operations." Chu's face had gone through several shades of color, settling on something between white and gray. His mouth worked soundlessly, trying to form words that wouldn't come. The $5,000 still sat on the table between them, the stack of bills now looking less like a boast and more like evidence. Kathleen wasn't finished. "Second, I should mention that I couldn't help but overhear your earlier conversation regarding smuggling routes through Incheon Port. Her tone remained perfectly polite, perfectly formal, but there was steel underneath now. While I'm certain that discussion was theoretical in nature, I feel compelled to note that the Azure's dining room, being a public space with excellent acoustics, may not provide the level of privacy such sensitive topics typically require. The gentleman dining alone near the corner window, for instance, has been quite attentive to the conversations around him. She gestured subtly toward the far corner of the restaurant, where an elderly Korean man sat by himself, newspaper folded beside his plate, his posture suggesting someone who'd been quietly observing everything. Kathleen had noticed him earlier. He'd been there when she'd arrived for her shift, his presence so unobtrusive that most staff had stopped registering him after the first hour. But she'd seen his eyes tracking across the room, seen the way he'd paused his meal during certain moments, and her instincts had flagged him as someone paying far more attention than his newspaper suggested. But returning to your order, Kathleen continued smoothly, while we cannot accommodate the blowfish preparation, I would be honored to recommend several alternatives that would showcase our chef's expertise with Korean seafood preparations. We have an exceptional raw halibut that could be prepared in a similar presentation style, served with traditional accompaniments. Alternatively, our sanekji preparation has received particular acclaim, live octopus prepared in the traditional style, served with sesame oil and sea salt. She paused, then added with the same flawless formality. Given the complexity of flavors you've indicated preference for, I would recommend pairing any seafood selection with our 2019 Domaine Leflave Puligny Montricot. The minerality and crisp acidity would complement the delicate seafood flavors while providing contrast to the spice elements you've requested in the sauce preparations. We also have a Korean makgeolli that our sommelier has selected specifically to pair with traditional preparations, if you'd prefer to maintain regional authenticity throughout your meal. The silence that followed her words was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to have diminished, as if the entire dining room had collectively leaned in to witness what was happening at table 5. Hannah's water glass had made it back to the table, set down with a small click that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet. Her hand had moved to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with an expression that combined shock, horror, and something that might have been suppressed delight. Chu Yonghee looked like a man who just watched his entire world rearrange itself into a configuration he couldn't recognize. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His hand moved unconsciously to his throat, as if checking that he could still breathe. The arrogant confidence that had characterized every moment since he'd walked into the restaurant had evaporated entirely, replaced by something raw and desperate. The look of someone realizing they'd just made a catastrophic mistake, but not yet understanding the full dimensions of their error. You speak Korean, he finally managed, the words coming out in English, his voice stripped of its earlier certainty. Kathleen smiled, a small, professional expression that contained multitudes. Yes, sir, she said, still in formal Korean. I completed my undergraduate degree in East Asian linguistics with a focus on Korean dialectical variations. My graduate research specifically examined sociolinguistic patterns in hierarchical business communications. The Busan market dialect you employed is actually quite fascinating from a historical perspective. It retains several grammatical constructions that have disappeared from the standard Seoul dialect, particularly in the informal speech registers used among traders and fishermen. She tilted her head slightly, her expression remaining perfectly polite. Your command of it is quite good, though I detected some vocabulary choices that suggest you learned it as an adult rather than acquiring it naturally during childhood. The way you pronounced certain vowels in the heavy slang terms showed Seoul influence. Understandable, given that Busan dialect is rarely taught formally. Most people who speak it learned from family or community immersion. Hannah made a sound that might have been a laugh or a gasp, quickly stifled behind her hand. Her eyes were darting between Chu's stricken expression and Kathleen's composed one, as if watching a tennis match where the score had suddenly and inexplicably reversed. Chu's face had progressed from gray to red, a flush of color that started at his collar and spread upward. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with tension. The watch on his wrist caught the light as his hand trembled slightly, those diamonds suddenly looking less like symbols of success and more like the gaudy costume jewelry of someone desperately trying to prove something. I think, Kathleen continued, her formal Korean maintaining its perfect courtesy, that perhaps we should start fresh with your order. Unless, of course, you'd like to proceed with the blowfish request, in which case I'll need to explain to our chef why we're attempting to serve an unlicensed and potentially lethal dish based on a customer's explicit instructions. I'm certain that conversation would be fascinating, particularly if we need to document it for liability purposes. The threat was delivered with such perfect politeness that it took a moment to register as a threat at all. But Chu heard it clearly, the implication that she'd understood not just his order but his entire intention, that she could document his attempt to set her up for failure, that she had witnesses to his cruel little game. Hana reached across the table, her hand finding Chu's arm. "Young-hee," she said quietly in Korean, "I think we should just order something from the menu." But Chu wasn't listening to Hana. He was staring at Kathleen with an expression that had moved past shock into something darker, something that combined humiliation with a growing awareness of danger. His mind was racing backward through the evening, replaying every word he'd spoken in Korean, every insulting comment he'd made assuming she couldn't understand. And more than that, he was remembering the specific details he'd discussed, the smuggling routes, the business operations, the casual admissions of illegal activity delivered in what he'd believed was a safe, secret language. The $5,000 still sat on the table between them, but nobody was looking at the money anymore. That bet, that elaborate trap designed to humiliate a waitress, had detonated in Chu's face with spectacular precision. He'd wanted to expose incompetence, and instead had exposed himself. His cruelty, his illegal activities, and most damaging of all, his fundamental stupidity in assuming that the person serving his water was too ignorant to understand the secrets he'd been speaking aloud. Kathleen stood with her order pad ready, her expression professional and patient, waiting for their response. The invisible wall was gone now, burned away in the moment she'd chosen truth over survival. What remained was simply Kathleen Perry, brilliant, educated, and absolutely done with pretending to be less than she was. "So," she said in perfect, formal Korean, "shall I give you a few more minutes to decide, or would you like to hear tonight's specials?" The transformation in Chu Young-hee's face was something Kathleen would remember for the rest of her life. It happened in stages, like watching time-lapse footage of ice melting or fruit rotting, a process that should have taken hours compressed into seconds. The shock that had frozen his features began to thaw, and what emerged underneath wasn't embarrassment or even anger. It was fear. Raw animal fear. His eyes, which moments ago had been wide with disbelief, now darted around the dining room with the frantic energy of a trapped creature seeking escape routes. His breathing had changed, becoming shallow and rapid, visible in the way his chest rose, and fell beneath the electric blue suit that suddenly looked less like a power statement and more like a costume that had failed its purpose. A thin sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead, catching the ambient light from the pendant fixtures overhead. Kathleen watched this transformation with the clinical detachment of someone observing a specimen under glass. Her linguistic training had always extended beyond mere language into the broader field of human communication. Body language, microexpressions, the physiological tells that revealed what words attempted to conceal. She was watching a man's brain perform rapid calculations, replaying conversations, assessing damage, measuring threat levels. Chu's hand moved to his phone on the table, his fingers twitching toward it before pulling back, as if he'd started to reach for a weapon before remembering he was in public. His jaw clenched and unclenched rhythmically, the muscles working beneath his skin. His other hand had released the table edge and was now pressed flat against his thigh, probably trying to stop his leg from bouncing. A self-soothing gesture that suggested his nervous system was flooding with adrenaline. "You," he started in Korean, then stopped, switching to English as if the language change might somehow reset the situation. "How long have you been working here?" The question seemed innocuous on its surface, but Kathleen heard the real inquiry underneath. "How much have you heard? How many other conversations have you understood? What else do you know?" 6 months, sir," Kathleen replied in English, her tone remaining professional. She'd switched languages to match him, a natural accommodation in multilingual conversation, but the move also served to remind him that she could operate in whatever linguistic space he chose. There was nowhere he could hide. Chu's mind was clearly racing through those 6 months, trying to calculate how many times he'd dined at the Azure, how many business conversations he'd conducted in Korean while servers moved around him like furniture. His eyes flickered to Hana, then back to Kathleen, then toward the elderly man in the corner that Kathleen had mentioned, the one who'd been quietly observing everything. "What else?" Chu's voice came out rough, and he cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "What else did you think you heard tonight?" "Think you heard?" The phrasing was deliberate, an attempt to introduce doubt, to suggest that perhaps Kathleen had misunderstood, that her comprehension was questionable. It was a lawyer's language, the verbal footwork of someone trying to create plausible deniability. But his delivery betrayed him. The question came out too urgent, too desperate to pass for casual clarification. Kathleen maintained her pleasant expression, though something had shifted in her eyes. She understood what was happening now. This wasn't just about embarrassment over his failed humiliation attempt. Chu had realized that he'd spent the last 30 minutes discussing criminal activities in what he'd believed was a secret code, and that code had just been cracked by someone who could potentially testify about everything she'd heard. "I'm not certain what you mean, sir," Kathleen said carefully. "I simply overheard the conversation you were having with your companion. My training in Korean linguistics means I tend to notice discussions in Korean, particularly when they involve business terminology." The phrase business terminology landed like a small detonation. Chu's face tightened, and for just a moment, something vicious flashed in his eyes, the look of a man who'd built his life on intimidation and violence, who'd learned that problems could be solved by making them disappear. Then the mask of civilized behavior reasserted itself, but not quite fast enough. Kathleen had seen what lived underneath. Hana was looking at Chu with an expression that had moved beyond discomfort into something approaching alarm. "Young-hee," she said quietly in Korean, "maybe we should just leave. We can go somewhere else for dinner." But Chu wasn't listening to Hana. His mind was working through scenarios, calculating odds, assessing options. Kathleen could almost see the thoughts forming behind his eyes. This waitress understands Korean. She heard me discussing port operations, shipping routes, customs arrangements. She heard specific names, specific locations. She heard enough to create problems, serious problems. Problems that could lead to investigations, audits, arrests. The criminal enterprise Chu had been so casually discussing wasn't some minor operation. Kathleen's memory replayed fragments of what she'd heard during his earlier conversation with Hana, before the elaborate ordering trap. He'd mentioned Incheon Port, talked about modified shipping containers, referenced someone named the accountant, who handled customs documentation. The details had seemed abstract when she'd first heard them, just background noise to process and dismiss. But now those fragments assembled themselves into a coherent picture, smuggling, almost certainly. Probably high-value goods, given Chu's obvious wealth and his connections to what he'd called the organization. And he discussed all of it in front of her, believing she was too stupid to understand, too insignificant to matter. Chu's hand moved to his water glass, gripping it tightly enough that Kathleen worried briefly that it might shatter. He took a long drink, using the moment to compose himself. When he set the glass down, his expression had hardened into something calculated and cold. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his English now carefully controlled, each word precisely articulated. "My companion and I were discussing a television show, a crime drama, very popular in Korea. Perhaps your understanding of cultural context isn't as comprehensive as your vocabulary." He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. It's easy to misinterpret conversations when you're not familiar with pop culture references. It was a decent attempt at recovery, the kind of explanation that might have worked if Kathleen hadn't heard the entire conversation in context, complete with specific numerical figures, dates, and logistical details that no television plot would require. But more telling than the words was the threat implicit in his tone. He was offering her an exit, a way to pretend she'd misunderstood, and embedded in that offer was a warning about what might happen if she didn't take it. "Of course, sir," Kathleen said neutrally, neither confirming nor denying his explanation. "My apologies if I misunderstood the context of your discussion." But her careful neutrality only seemed to increase Chu's agitation. He wanted her to commit, to explicitly state that she'd been mistaken, to give him something he could point to later as proof that she'd admitted her own unreliability. Her refusal to do so left the threat of her knowledge hanging in the air between them. Chu's eyes darted to his phone again, and this time his hand actually moved toward it before stopping. Kathleen understood that impulse too. He wanted to call someone, to report this problem, to set in motion whatever mechanisms he had access to for dealing with threats. But he couldn't do it here, not in the middle of a crowded restaurant, not with witnesses around. Whatever action he decided to take would need to wait until he had privacy. The $5,000 still sat on the table, now looking less like a bet and more like evidence of premeditation. Chu stared at the money for a moment, then swept it back into his wallet with jerky, aggressive movements. The gesture was partly practical, removing evidence of the bet he'd made, but mostly it seemed to be a way to channel the violent energy that was clearly building in his body. His movements were too sharp, too forceful, the physical expression of someone barely containing their rage. "Young-hee, please," Hana said again, her voice taking on an edge of genuine fear. She'd picked up on the same signals Kathleen had noticed, the shift from embarrassed arrogance to something far more dangerous. "Let's just go. We don't need to eat here. We can leave." Hana understood her companion better than Kathleen did. She'd seen this progression before, this particular pathway from humiliation to fury to action. And whatever action Chu typically took when he felt threatened, it clearly frightened Hana enough that she wanted to remove them both from the situation immediately. But Chu was shaking his head, a small, tight movement that suggested he'd already committed to a course of action. "No," he said quietly, still in English. "No, we're not leaving. We're going to stay and have a proper meal. We're going to show that there are no hard feelings, no misunderstandings. Everything is perfectly fine." The words were ostensibly conciliatory, but his tone carried an undercurrent of something else entirely. Kathleen recognized it with a chill that ran down her spine. This was the voice of someone making a threat while disguising it as friendliness, the verbal equivalent of a predator's smile. Chu looked directly at Kathleen, and his expression was now one of calculated assessment. He was studying her the way he might study a business problem, looking for weaknesses, identifying pressure points, determining the most efficient method of neutralization. "I'm sure our server here is very professional," he said, his words clearly meant for her benefit. "I'm sure she understands that customer conversations are private, that anything overheard in the course of her duties is confidential." "That's part of the job, isn't it? Discretion." The subtext was unmistakable. "Keep your mouth shut about what you heard, or there will be consequences." Kathleen maintained her professional composure, but internally she was recalculating her own risk assessment. She dropped the mask of incomprehension, thinking it would simply expose Chu's cruelty and perhaps restore some small measure of her own dignity. She hadn't fully considered that the man she was dealing with might have the resources and the willingness to make serious problems for people who threatened his operations. "All servers at the Azure are trained in professional discretion," Kathleen said carefully, the response neutral enough to be interpreted multiple ways. She was buying time, trying to think through her options while maintaining the appearance of calm. But Chu wasn't satisfied with ambiguity. His jaw tightened, and Kathleen could see him making a decision, watching the moment when fear calcified into determination. He'd realized that vague threats weren't enough, that this problem needed a more permanent solution. The waitress who'd been invisible had suddenly become visible, and visible threats needed to be eliminated. "Actually," Chu said, his voice taking on a new quality, something harder, more authoritative, "I need to speak with your manager. Immediately." Hana's hand flew to Chu's arm. "What are you doing?" she hissed in Korean, her careful composure finally cracking. "Just leave it alone. Let's go, please." Chu shook off her hand without looking at her, his eyes locked on Kathleen. "I need to speak with your manager," he repeated, louder this time, his voice carrying across the nearby tables. Several diners turned to look, drawn by the shift in his tone. "There's been a serious incident, a very serious incident." Kathleen's stomach dropped. She understood immediately what was about to happen. Chu couldn't threaten her directly. That would be too obvious, too risky. But he could discredit her. He could manufacture a complaint, create a narrative where she was the problem, get her fired before she had the chance to report anything she'd overheard. A fired waitress with a customer complaint on her record would have no credibility if she went to the police. It was elegant in its viciousness. He would destroy her ability to threaten him by destroying her reputation first. "I'll get him for you right away, sir," Kathleen said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now flooding her own system. She turned to leave, and as she did, she caught a glimpse of the elderly Korean man in the corner. He'd set down his newspaper entirely now and was watching their table with undisguised interest, his expression unreadable but his attention absolute. As Kathleen walked toward the kitchen to find Raymond, her mind was racing. The invisible wall she'd maintained for 6 months was gone, burned away in a moment of justified defiance. But what she'd revealed by dropping that wall had put her in genuine danger. Chu Young-hee wasn't just an arrogant customer. He was a criminal with resources, with connections, with the ability to make serious problems for people who threatened his operations. And she'd just made herself his biggest problem. Behind her, she heard Chu's voice speaking rapidly in Korean to Hana, too quietly for Kathleen to make out the words from this distance. But she didn't need to hear them to know what he was planning. The man who'd entered the restaurant radiating arrogant confidence was now calculating how to destroy a waitress before she could destroy him. The question was whether Kathleen could find a way to protect herself before he succeeded. Kathleen pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen's controlled chaos, the temperature change hitting her like a physical force. The air was thick with steam, the sharp sense of garlic and gochujang, the metallic tang of hot oil. The line cooks moved with choreographed precision, their calls and responses forming a rhythm that had no room for hesitation or error. David Cho was barking orders in his mixture of English and Korean, his voice cutting through the mechanical hum of ventilation hoods and the hiss of food hitting hot surfaces. Raymond was near the expediting station, his clipboard pressed against his chest like armor, examining a plate arrangement with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting a diamond for flaws. He looked up as Kathleen approached, and something in her expression must have telegraphed trouble because his own face immediately tightened with preemptive stress. "What is it?" Raymond asked, his voice low and tense. Around them, the kitchen continued its mechanical dance, indifferent to whatever drama was unfolding in the front of house. "Table 5, Kathleen said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "Mr. Chu has requested to speak with you. He says there's been a serious incident." Raymond's eyes closed briefly, a gesture that conveyed both resignation and barely suppressed panic. "What kind of incident?" Each word came out clipped, precise, the verbal equivalent of someone preparing for impact. Kathleen hesitated, trying to determine how much to explain. The full story, that she'd understood every word of Chu's Korean, that she'd heard him discussing criminal operations, that she'd publicly demonstrated her comprehension, and now he was in damage control mode, seemed too complex and too dangerous to articulate in the middle of a busy kitchen. "I'm not entirely certain," she said carefully, which was technically true. She didn't know exactly what accusation Chu was preparing, only that it was coming. "Of course you're not certain," Raymond muttered, setting down his clipboard with the careful control of someone who wanted to throw it but couldn't afford the loss of professional composure. "Stay here. Don't go back to that table. I'll handle this." He straightened his tie, smoothed his vest, and took a breath that was meant to be calming but came out shaky. Then he pushed through the kitchen door back into the dining room, his expression rearranging itself into the mask of concerned professional management that his job required. Kathleen stood in the kitchen's heat, surrounded by the symphony of dinner service, her heart hammering against her ribs. Miguel glanced over from his station, catching her eye and raising his eyebrows in a silent question, but she shook her head. Not now. She couldn't explain, couldn't process, couldn't do anything except wait to find out what destruction Chu Young-hee was about to rain down on her life. Through the small window in the kitchen door, she could see Raymond approaching table 5, his body language projecting concerned attentiveness. She saw Chu stand up, a sharp, aggressive movement that made nearby diners turn their heads. She saw Raymond's hands come up in a placating gesture, saw his mouth moving in words she couldn't hear. The tableau played out like a silent film, all gesture and expression without sound. Then Chu's voice cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant, loud enough to penetrate even the kitchen's insulated chaos. "I need to report a theft." The words carried with them a particular kind of violence, the verbal equivalent of pulling a fire alarm. Kathleen watched through the small window as every head in the dining room turned toward table 5. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Silverware paused halfway to mouths. The entire restaurant's attention focused like a spotlight on the man in the electric blue suit who stood with his hands raised, his face arranged in an expression of outraged disbelief. "My watch," Chu was saying, his voice pitched to carry across the entire space. "My watch is missing. It was right here on my wrist and now it's gone. A $50,000 Patek Philippe custom diamond setting. Someone has stolen it." Miguel whistled low between his teeth. $50,000, he said quietly. "That's not just a theft, that's a felony." Kathleen's blood had gone cold. She watched Raymond's body language shift from concerned to alarmed, watched him say something to Chu that she couldn't hear, watched Chu shake his head with theatrical emphasis. This was the plan, then. Not just a complaint about poor service, but an actual crime. An accusation serious enough that police would be called, that her employment would be terminated immediately, that her credibility would be destroyed before she could speak to anyone about what she'd overheard. It was brilliant in its cruelty. A fired waitress accused of theft had no credibility. Even if the accusation didn't stick, even if there was no evidence, the mere fact of it would follow her. Future employers would see the termination, the police report, the incident. Who would believe anything she claimed about overhearing criminal conversations when she'd been accused of stealing from the very customer she was making allegations about? Through the window, she watched Raymond speaking urgently, probably asking what had happened, when Chu had last seen the watch, whether he was absolutely certain it had been stolen rather than misplaced. Standard manager protocol for these situations: verify the claim before escalating to involving law enforcement. Chu was shaking his head, his gestures growing more agitated. "I know exactly when it disappeared," he said, his voice still loud enough for Kathleen to hear even from the kitchen. "It was when your waitress came to take our order. She was standing right here, and I felt something. I thought she'd bumped my arm reaching across the table. But now I realized she was stealing my watch right off my wrist." The accusation was absurd on its face. You couldn't remove someone's watch without them noticing, couldn't unfasten a clasp and slide an expensive timepiece off someone's wrist while they were conscious and aware. But the absurdity didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd made the claim publicly, that witnesses had heard it, that the machinery of consequence was now in motion. David Cho had stopped barking orders, his attention drawn to the drama visible through the kitchen door window. "What's happening?" he asked, moving closer to where Kathleen stood frozen. "The customer at table 5 is claiming someone stole his watch," Miguel explained, his eyes also fixed on the scene unfolding in the dining room. "Who's he accusing?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Before anyone could respond, Raymond pushed back through the kitchen door, his face flushed and his movements sharp with stress. His eyes found Kathleen immediately. "Perry, I need you to come with me, now." "What's happening?" Kathleen asked, though she knew, had known from the moment Chu had decided she was a threat that needed to be neutralized. "Mr. Chu is claiming that his watch was stolen while you were at his table," Raymond said, his voice tight and formal, already distancing himself from her. "He's insisting that we search you before calling the police." "That's ridiculous," Kathleen said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded defensive, exactly how a guilty person would respond. "I didn't take his watch. I didn't touch him at all." "Then you won't mind being searched," Raymond said, the statement phrased as logic but functioning as a trap. "Refuse and look guilty. Submit and validate the accusation. There was no good option." "Raymond, this is insane," Kathleen said, hearing the edge of desperation creeping into her voice and hatting it. "Why would I steal from a customer? How would I even?" "I don't know what happened," Raymond interrupted, his tone suggesting he very much had already decided what had happened. "But we need to resolve this immediately. The customer is threatening to call the police and sue the restaurant for employing thieves. So either we search you and prove his accusation is baseless, or he makes that call and it becomes an official police matter with you as the prime suspect." It was already a police matter in Chu's mind, Kathleen knew. This search wasn't about finding the watch, it was about theater, about publicly humiliating her, about creating a narrative that would destroy her credibility. But she had no choice. Refusing would only make her look more guilty, would give Chu exactly what he wanted. "Fine," she said, her voice hollow. "Search me, I don't have his watch." Raymond nodded curtly and gestured toward the back hallway that led to the employee lockers and the manager's office. Not here, in private. As Kathleen followed Raymond through the kitchen, she was aware of every eye tracking her movement. The cooks had all stopped working, dinner service temporarily suspended by drama. Their expressions ranged from sympathetic to suspicious, and she couldn't even blame the suspicious ones. How many times had she herself heard about restaurant theft, about servers pocketing cash or stealing valuables left on tables? It happened. Not often, but enough that the accusation carried inherent plausibility. They walked past the dish pit where Tamaz stood with his hands still in the gray water, his weathered face creased with concern. They passed the walk-in cooler with its industrial hum, the dry storage with its careful inventory labels, the employee area with its battered lockers, and the bulletin board covered in work schedules and health code posters. Raymond opened the door to his small office, barely more than a closet with a desk and a filing cabinet, and gestured for Kathleen to enter. "Empty your apron pockets," Raymond said, his tone clinical now, professional distance fully engaged. He was protecting himself, Kathleen realized. If she really had stolen the watch, he needed to demonstrate that he'd followed proper protocol. If she hadn't, he still needed to demonstrate that he'd taken the accusations seriously enough to investigate thoroughly. Kathleen reached into her apron pockets with hands that had started to tremble despite her efforts to control them. She pulled out her order pad, 2 pens, a wine key, a handful of single-dollar bills from tips, some loose change. She set each item on Raymond's desk with deliberate care, creating a small inventory of her innocence. "Turn the pockets inside out," Raymond said. She did, showing the empty fabric. The pockets of her black slacks were next, nothing except a tissue and her locker key. Her hands were shaking visibly now, adrenaline and fear and rage all combining into a physical tremor she couldn't suppress. "There's nothing," she said, hearing her voice crack slightly. "Raymond, I swear to you I didn't take his watch. This is—" "Wait," Raymond said, his eyes fixed on something on his desk. He reached past the items Kathleen had emptied from her pockets and picked up her order pad, flipping it open. Several napkins fell out from between the pages, and as they fluttered to the desk, something caught the light. Something that glittered with diamond fire. Kathleen's breath stopped in her chest. Nestled among the white napkins was a watch, an unmistakably expensive watch, its face surrounded by a setting of diamonds that caught the fluorescent office lighting and transformed it into rainbow fire. The band was platinum or white gold, heavy and substantial, the kind of weight that would make its presence known on a wrist. The watch face showed complications in multiple subdeals, the kind of craftsmanship that indeed could cost $50,000. "No," Kathleen said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "No, that's not, I didn't." But even as she spoke, she knew how it sounded. She knew what Raymond was seeing, a waitress caught with a customer's expensive watch hidden in her order pad, the exact location where she could have quickly stashed it while pretending to write down an order. The evidence was damning in its simplicity. No ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation. Raymond's face had gone hard, all the professional courtesy draining away to reveal disappointment and anger underneath. "Kathleen," he said, her first name sounding like an accusation. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I didn't take it," Kathleen said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears, the protest of someone caught red-handed trying desperately to deny reality. "Raymond, I swear to you, someone planted that. It wasn't there when I—" "Someone planted it," Raymond repeated, his tone making the claim sound as absurd as it probably was. "Someone planted a $50,000 watch in your order pad. The customer somehow snuck into the kitchen while you were gone and framed you." "Not the kitchen," Kathleen said, her mind racing backward through the evening, trying to understand the mechanics of what had happened. "At the table. When I was taking his order, he must have. There was a moment when he reached across, I thought he was gesturing, but he could have slipped it between the pages then. Raymond, you have to believe me. This is a setup. He's trying to discredit me because I—" She stopped, realizing that explaining why Chu would want to discredit her would require revealing that she'd understood his Korean conversation about smuggling operations, which would sound paranoid and desperate, exactly how a thief would sound while trying to deflect blame. Raymond was already shaking his head, his expression suggesting he'd heard enough. I need to call Mr. Chu back here, he said, reaching for his phone. And then we're calling the police. Kathleen, I'm sorry, but you're terminated effective immediately. You need to surrender your apron and leave the premises before law enforcement arrives. Raymond, please, Kathleen started, but he was already moving past her, opening the office door, clearly done with the conversation. Through the doorway, Kathleen could see the kitchen staff pretending to work while actually watching the drama unfold. She could see Miguel's sympathetic face, David's carefully neutral expression, Tomas's weathered features creased with concern. She could see her entire life collapsing in real time, the job she needed to pay for Dion's treatment, her clean employment record, her freedom potentially forfeit to a false accusation she had no way to disprove. Chu Yonghee had executed his plan with precision. He'd created a crime, manufactured evidence, and destroyed her credibility in one elegant move, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The watch sat on Raymond's desk, glittering with malevolent beauty, silent testimony to a theft Kathleen hadn't committed and couldn't prove she hadn't committed. She was trapped, and they both knew it. He's willing to send an innocent woman to jail just to save his own skin. This is pure evil. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see Kathleen take this monster down. Raymond had his phone in hand, his thumb hovering over the screen, when a voice cut through the kitchen's tense atmosphere with the authority of a judge's gavel striking wood. That will not be necessary. The voice came from the dining room, carrying through the open office door with a quality that demanded attention without requiring volume. It was the kind of voice that had spent decades issuing commands and expecting obedience, refined by age, but losing none of its power in the refinement. Every head in the kitchen turned toward the source. Through the doorway, Kathleen could see movement in the dining room. The elderly Korean man who'd been sitting alone in the corner, the one she'd noticed earlier, the one who'd been quietly observing everything, was standing now. He rose with the deliberate care of someone whose body required consideration, but whose bearing suggested that consideration was a concession to physics rather than frailty. He folded his newspaper with precise movements and set it on his table beside his half-finished meal. Raymond's thumb had frozen over his phone screen. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this is a private matter between the restaurant and our employee." "Nothing that occurs in a public dining room is truly private," the elderly man said, his English accented but impeccable, each word enunciated with the clarity of someone who'd learned the language through formal study rather than immersion. Particularly when it involves false accusations and theatrical performances designed to deceive. He began walking toward the kitchen, his gait measured but steady. He was shorter than Kathleen had realized from seeing him seated, perhaps 5'7", but he moved with a kind of gravitational presence that made his physical stature irrelevant. He wore a simple dark suit, well-tailored but understated, the kind of expensive clothing that announced its quality through cut and fabric rather than flash. His face was deeply lined, the map of 7 or 8 decades of life etched into skin that had the particular texture of someone who'd spent significant time outdoors before age and status moved him inside. His hair was silver-white, cut short and neat, and his eyes, dark and sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, carried an intelligence that seemed to catalog and assess everything they encountered. The kitchen staff parted instinctively as he approached, creating a path not because he demanded it, but because his presence simply reorganized space around itself. David Cho, who normally treated everyone except his suppliers and the restaurant owner with barely disguised contempt, actually bowed slightly as the man passed, a gesture so reflexive it seemed unconscious. The elderly man stopped at the threshold of Raymond's office, his eyes moving from the manager to Kathleen to the watch sitting on the desk, its diamonds still catching the light. His expression remained neutral, but Kathleen saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition, perhaps. Or confirmation of something he'd already concluded. "Who are you?" Raymond asked, his tone caught between irritation at the interruption and uncertainty about whether this person required deference. "My name is Oh Sang-jin," the man said simply, as if the name alone should convey all necessary information. "Chairman Oh, if you prefer formality. I have been dining quietly in your establishment for the past 3 hours, observing the evening's service with interest." Raymond's face had gone pale. Even Kathleen, with her limited knowledge of Korean business culture, recognized that chairman as a title carried significant weight. This wasn't just an elderly diner. This was someone of substantial position, someone whose opinion could make or break reputations. Chairman O, Raymond said, his voice taking on an obsequious quality that Kathleen had never heard from him before. I apologize for any disturbance. We're dealing with an internal matter, an accusation of theft from one of our customers. We'll have it resolved quickly and... You will resolve nothing by calling the police to arrest an innocent woman, Chairman O interrupted, his tone not raised but carrying an edge that suggested contradiction would be unwise. Because that is precisely what you were about to do, is it not? Arrest Ms. Perry based on the word of a man whose integrity is, shall we say, questionable at best. Sir, with respect, the watch was found in her possession, Raymond said, gesturing toward the desk. The evidence is quite clear. Evidence, Chairman O repeated, the word carrying a weight of skepticism. Yes, let us discuss evidence. I have been sitting in this restaurant since 5:30 this evening. I chose that particular corner table because it offers excellent sightlines across the entire dining room, a habit from my years in business, always preferring to see all exits and entrances. From that vantage point, I have observed many things. He moved fully into the small office now, his presence making the already cramped space feel even smaller. Raymond stepped back instinctively, creating room. Chairman O reached past him and picked up the watch from the desk, holding it up to examine it in the light. The diamonds caught the fluorescent glow and scattered it across the office walls in fractured rainbows. An expensive piece, Chairman O observed. Patek Philippe, as Mr. Chu claimed. Though I notice he specified $50,000 when in fact this particular model with this diamond setting retails for closer to $75,000. Interesting that he would undervalue his own property, is it not? Almost as if he anticipated insurance complications and wanted to keep the reported value below certain threshold amounts. Raymond's mouth opened and closed without sound. Kathleen found herself holding her breath, watching this elderly man dismantle Chu's narrative with the precision of a surgeon working with a scalpel. But I digress, Chairman O continued. The relevant observation is this. I watched Mr. Chu throughout his meal. I watched him speak cruelly to his companion in Korean, assuming, incorrectly as it happens, that no one present could understand him. I watched him engage in an elaborate performance designed to humiliate your employee, Ms. Perry here, by ordering dishes not available on your menu in a dialect calculated to be obscure. And I watched what happened when Ms. Perry revealed her comprehension of his language. He set the watch back on the desk with a gentle click. Mr. Chu's reaction was most illuminating. I have spent 40 years in business, much of it dealing with individuals who operate in the gray areas of legality. I know the particular expression that crosses a man's face when he realizes he has been speaking too freely in front of the wrong person. I saw that expression on Mr. Chu's face the moment Ms. Perry responded in Korean. Chairman O turned to look directly at Kathleen, his sharp eyes meeting hers. You understood his earlier conversation as well, did you not? The discussion about port operations, shipping routes, customs arrangements. You heard him discussing business that cannot withstand scrutiny. Kathleen hesitated, glancing at Raymond, whose face had progressed through several shades of confusion. Yes, sir, she said finally. I understood everything. Of course you did, Chairman O said, something that might have been approval flickering across his features. Your linguistic training would have made that inevitable. And Mr. Chu, realizing his error, needed to discredit you before you could share what you'd heard with anyone who might act on that information. Hence the theater of the theft. You're saying the customer planted his own watch on her? Raymond asked, his tone suggesting he was struggling to process this reversal. I am not saying it, Chairman O replied. I am stating it as an observed fact. I watched Mr. Chu's hands throughout the interaction. When Ms. Perry approached the table to take their order, she set her order pad on the edge of the table. Standard practice, I believe, to have a writing surface easily accessible. Mr. Chu made a gesture, ostensibly reaching for his water glass that brought his hand near the order pad. The movement was quick, but not so quick that I failed to notice him removing his watch and sliding it between the pages of her pad. He looked at Raymond with an expression that conveyed both patience and warning. I saw the entire sequence. Mr. Chu removed his own watch and planted it on your employee. then waited a calculated amount of time before creating a scene and demanding she be searched. It was competently executed. I will grant him that. Had I not been paying attention, had I not been specifically watching because his earlier behavior had flagged him as someone worth observing, he might have succeeded. The silence in the office was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the kitchen seemed to have diminished, as if the entire restaurant were holding its breath. Kathleen felt something unlock in her chest, not relief, not yet, but the first possibility of relief, the recognition that someone with authority had witnessed the truth and was willing to speak it. Why would he do such a thing? Raymond asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand. Because Ms. Perry is a threat to him, Chairman O said simply. Not intentionally, perhaps, but a threat nonetheless. She possesses knowledge about his operations that could prove damaging if shared with appropriate authorities. By framing her for theft, by destroying her credibility and employment, he removes that threat. A fired waitress accused of stealing has no credibility to make allegations about criminal activity overheard during the course of her work. It is, from his perspective, an elegant solution. Chairman O turned back to Kathleen, and his expression softened slightly. I apologize that you were subjected to this, Miss Perry. Men like Mr. Chu view the world as a hierarchy of power, with those in service positions existing solely for their convenience. The notion that someone serving his meal might possess intelligence equal or superior to his own is incomprehensible to him. His arrogance made him careless, and his carelessness has now exposed him to consequences he likely never imagined. Sir, Raymond interjected, his voice cautious, what you're describing is a serious accusation against a customer. If we act on your statement and you're mistaken, or if this is somehow a misunderstanding. I am not mistaken, Chairman O said, his voice taking on a quality that suggested the conversation was concluded. And if you require additional verification, I would suggest examining the security footage from your dining room cameras. I noticed at least 3 cameras with clear views of Table 5. They will confirm everything I have described. Raymond's face went through another transformation. He'd clearly forgotten about the security cameras, which were primarily installed to deter theft and monitor staff, but which recorded everything that occurred in the dining room. If Chairman O's account was accurate, the footage would show Chu planting the watch himself. I will provide a full statement, Chairman O continued, and I am prepared to testify to what I witnessed should this matter proceed to legal action. But first, I believe we should address the situation in your dining room, where Mr. Chu is undoubtedly wondering why the police have not yet arrived to arrest the woman he has framed. He gestured toward the dining room with one hand, a motion that somehow conveyed both invitation and command. Shall we? I believe Mr. Chu and I have matters to discuss, long overdue matters as it happens. There was something in the way Chairman O said this last statement, a weight beneath the words, a suggestion of history and authority that made Kathleen's spine straighten with attention. This wasn't just an elderly diner who'd happened to witness a crime. This was someone who knew Chu Yonghee, or knew of him, and whose intervention carried implications beyond simply correcting an injustice. Raymond was nodding, his earlier certainty completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate desire to avoid making a catastrophic mistake. Yes, of course. Chairman O, if you'll follow me. Ms. Perry should accompany us, Chairman O said, cutting off Raymond's attempt to take control of the situation. She is owed an apology, and she should witness what happens next. I believe she has earned that right. He looked at Kathleen directly, and something in his eyes suggested he understood exactly what the past hour had cost her. The fear, the humiliation, the sense of helplessness in the face of manufactured accusations. Come, he said gently. Let us go collect the justice you are owed. Kathleen picked up the watch from Raymond's desk, holding it carefully, and followed Chairman O out of the cramped office, through the kitchen where every staff member stood watching with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning understanding, and back into the dining room where Chu Yonghee sat waiting for his trap to spring closed. He had no idea that the trap was about to close on him instead. The dining room had transformed during Kathleen's absence in the office. What had been the typical Friday evening atmosphere of muted conversations and clinking silverware had evolved into something else entirely, a theater waiting for its final act. Nearly every diner had abandoned the pretense of eating. their attention focused on table 5, where Chu Yonghee sat with Hana, his posture radiating impatient vindication. He'd been checking his phone repeatedly, clearly expecting the arrival of police vehicles. The satisfaction of watching Kathleen Perry led away in handcuffs. When Chairman O emerged from the kitchen with Kathleen and Raymond following behind, Chu's head snapped up. His expression cycled through confusion. Why was the old man from the corner involved? Then irritation at the delay, then something darker as he registered the way Chairman O moved through the space, the way other diners tracked his passage with recognition in their eyes. Chairman O walked with measured steps, his path taking him not toward his own table, but directly toward table 5. The restaurant had gone almost silent, the kind of hush that falls when everyone present senses they're about to witness something significant. Even the kitchen noise seemed to have diminished, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Chu stood as Chairman O approached, a reflexive gesture of courtesy that he seemed to regret immediately, as if standing had somehow ceded a tactical advantage. "Can I help you?" he asked in English, his tone caught between dismissiveness and uncertainty. Up close, Chairman O's age was more apparent, but so was something else, a quality of presence that made Chu's expensive suit and diamond watch look like costume jewelry on a child playing dress-up. "Sit down, Yonghee," Chairman O said quietly, switching to Korean. Not a request, a command. The use of his given name without honorifics, delivered in that tone of absolute authority, made Chu's face drain of color. He sat down abruptly, the movement graceless and automatic. Hana, who'd been watching this exchange with growing alarm, pushed her chair back slightly, as if trying to distance herself from whatever was about to occur. Chairman O remained standing, positioning himself so that while he appeared to be addressing Chu, his voice would carry across the dining room to the dozens of witnesses who were now watching without pretense. "I have been sitting in this restaurant for 3 hours, he said, still in Korean, his voice pitched to carry without shouting. 3 hours of observing the evening service, of watching how people conduct themselves when they believe they are among inferiors who cannot understand them, who cannot judge them." He paused, letting the words settle. Several of the nearby diners were Korean or Korean American, Kathleen realized, watching their expressions shift as they followed Chairman O's words. Others might not understand the language, but were reading the body language clearly enough. This was a reckoning. "I watched you enter this establishment with arrogance," Chairman O continued. "I watched you treat the staff with contempt. I watched you speak cruelly about a young woman who was serving you with professionalism and dignity, using language as a weapon because you believed yourself safe behind the barrier of her presumed ignorance." Chu's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. "I don't know what you think you saw, but—" "Be silent," Chairman O said, the 2 words carrying such weight that Chu's mouth snapped shut as if physically compelled. "I am not finished. I watched you discover that this young woman understood every word you'd spoken. I saw the precise moment when you realized you had discussed matters that cannot withstand scrutiny, that you had exposed operations that require darkness to function. And I watched you make the decision to destroy her rather than accept responsibility for your own carelessness." Chairman O turned slightly, gesturing to Kathleen, who still held Chu's watch in her hand. "I watched you remove your own watch and plant it in Ms. Perry's order pad. I watched you wait a calculated interval before creating a theatrical scene, before demanding she be searched, before attempting to have her arrested for a theft you yourself had staged." The color had returned to Chu's face now, but as a deep flush that started at his collar and spread upward. "That's absurd," he said, but his voice cracked on the words, betraying him. "Why would I?" "To discredit her before she could report what she'd overheard," Chairman O said calmly. "A fired waitress accused of theft has no credibility. A clever plan, I will grant you that. Competently executed. It would have worked had I not been watching. Had I not been paying very close attention to you specifically because your behavior flagged you as someone worth observing." He moved closer to the table, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture suggesting a teacher addressing a disappointing student. "Do you know why I was paying such close attention to you, Yonghee? Can you guess why a man of my age would spend his Friday evening in a restaurant, reading a newspaper he'd already finished, watching the dining room with particular interest?" Chu shook his head mutely, but something in his eyes suggested a terrible suspicion was beginning to form. "Because I received a report 3 days ago," Chairman O said, his voice taking on a harder edge now, about certain operations in Incheon, shipping irregularities, modified containers, customs documentation that didn't match cargo manifests. The report mentioned that these operations were being coordinated by a young, ambitious member of an organization I have significant interest in. An organization I helped build 40 years ago, long before you were born. The air seemed to have been sucked out of the dining room. Every person present understood they were witnessing something beyond a customer complaint, beyond even the exposure of a frame-up. This was something else entirely. Chairman O's voice remained calm, almost conversational, but underneath ran a current of absolute authority. The report gave me a name, Chu Yonghee. It described a man who believed his cleverness entitled him to operate without oversight, who confused the absence of immediate consequences with permission, who mistook my distance from day-to-day operations as weakness rather than delegation. Chu had gone gray now, a sickly pallor that made his expensive suit look like a shroud. Chairman O, he whispered, the title emerging with the recognition of who exactly he'd been performing for. I didn't know, I would never have. You would never have spoken so freely had you known I was present, Chairman O finished for him. Yes, that much is evident. But the fact that you would speak this way at all, that you would discuss sensitive operations in a public restaurant, that you would treat people with such contempt simply because you believed yourself beyond their comprehension. These things tell me everything I need to know about your judgment and your character. He turned to address the dining room at large, switching to English now so that everyone present could understand. I built my organization on certain principles: discretion, honor, respect for those who serve, regardless of their station, the understanding that true power requires no demonstration, that those who must announce their importance possess none. His gaze returned to Chu, and there was something almost sad in his expression now, the disappointment of someone who'd hoped for better. You possess none of these qualities. You are a man who must steal from the poor to feel rich, who must diminish others to feel elevated, who mistakes cruelty for strength. You have no honor, and a man without honor has no place at my table. The words fell like a judge's sentence, final and irrevocable. Around the dining room, those who understood the full implications of what was being said watched with expressions that mixed shock and fascination. Chairman O was doing more than firing an employee. He was severing someone from an entire network of power and protection, casting them out into a world where they would face consequences without support. You are dismissed from your position, effective immediately, Chairman O continued, switching back to Korean for these crucial words. You will surrender all access, all connections, all resources you've been provided. You will discover that doors which opened easily will now remain closed, that phone calls will go unreturned, that the protection you've enjoyed no longer exists. And you will face the legal consequences of your actions here tonight, the attempted frame-up, the false accusations, without the benefit of organizational support. Was shaking now, his hands trembling visibly on the table. Please, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Chairman O, please, I can explain. There is nothing to explain, Chairman O said. I have seen everything I need to see. Your judgment is flawed. Your character is compromised. And most damning of all, you lack the wisdom to recognize when you are in the presence of those who surpass you. He gestured to. This young woman, whom you treated as beneath your notice, possesses more honor in her restraint tonight than you have demonstrated in your entire career. He turned to, who'd been standing frozen throughout this entire exchange. Your employee is innocent of all accusations. The watch was planted by Mr. himself, as I am prepared to testify under oath. I recommend you review your security footage, which will confirm everything I've stated. Ms. Perry's employment should be continued without blemish on her record, and I would suggest she deserves both an apology and compensation for the distress this incident has caused. Nodded frantically. Yes, of course, Chairman O. Ms. Perry, I sincerely apologize. But Chairman O raised a hand, cutting off the manager's words. He turned to, his expression softening slightly. Ms. Perry, I wonder if I might speak with you privately before I leave this evening. I have a proposition that may interest you. Found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. Yes, sir, of course. Chairman O nodded, satisfied, then looked one final time at, who sat collapsed in his chair, the electric blue suit that had announced his confidence now looking garish and absurd. You should leave now. Take your companion, settle your bill, and leave. And understand that what protection you once enjoyed is gone. What happens next will depend entirely on your own actions and whatever mercy you can convince the authorities to grant. I will not intervene on your behalf. Stood on unsteady legs, pulling out his wallet with shaking hands. Had already grabbed her clutch and was moving toward the exit, clearly wanting to be as far from this disaster as possible. Threw several $100 bills on the table, too much probably, but he was beyond calculating proper amounts, and turned to follow her. As he passed, he paused, and for just a moment their eyes met. His expression held something that might have been hatred, or might have been fear, or might have been the desperate recognition of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. Then he was moving again, walking rapidly toward the exit, his gait suggesting someone fleeing a crime scene. The restaurant remained silent as and departed, the heavy oak door closing behind them with a solid thunk that felt symbolic. Then, gradually, the ambient noise returned, conversations resuming in hushed tones, silverware moving again, the normal sounds of an evening service attempting to reassert themselves over what had just occurred. Chairman O turned his attention back to, and his expression became almost grandfatherly, the stern authority that had just destroyed a man's career giving way to something warmer. You handled yourself with remarkable composure, Miss Perry. Not many people could have maintained such dignity in the face of what you endured tonight. I didn't have much choice, sir, said, still holding watch, which now felt heavy with symbolism. I need this job, my brother. Yes, Chairman O interrupted gently. Your brother requires a kidney transplant, and the medical expenses have forced you to leave your graduate studies to work in service while you try to save enough for his surgery. I hope you don't mind. I made some inquiries while your manager was searching you. I like to understand situations fully before I intervene. Felt her throat tighten. The idea that this powerful man had taken the time to investigate her circumstances, to understand what was really at stake, was almost overwhelming. I have a proposition for you, Chairman O continued. My organization requires someone with your linguistic skills, someone fluent in Korean dialects, who understands cultural nuances, who can operate in international business settings. The position would pay substantially more than you earn here, with full medical benefits that would cover your brother's surgery and ongoing care. He smiled slightly at her expression. Before you ask, yes, my organization has legitimate business operations. Many of them, in fact. Most of what I built over 40 years is entirely legal, though I'm aware that certain individuals have used my infrastructure for less honorable purposes. That is something I am currently working to correct. Having someone like you on my staff, someone with integrity, intelligence, and the courage to maintain their principles under pressure, would be valuable. Mind was reeling, trying to process the sudden reversal of her circumstances. An hour ago, she'd been facing arrest and unemployment. Now, she was being offered a position by the head of what appeared to be a significant business empire, with benefits that would solve the medical crisis that had consumed her life for the past year. I don't know what to say, she managed. Say you'll consider it, Chairman O said. Take the weekend, think about what you want for your future, then call this number on Monday. He produced a business card from his jacket pocket, plain cream with simple black text, a phone number and nothing else. We'll discuss the specifics then. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her one more time. You have a gift, Miss Perry. Not just for languages, but for maintaining grace under pressure, for seeing clearly when others are trying to blind you with fear or intimidation. Those qualities are rare and valuable. Don't waste them in a place that doesn't appreciate what you offer. And then he was walking toward his corner table to collect his coat and newspaper, moving through the dining room with the same measured steps, leaving standing in the middle of the azure, holding a watch that wasn't hers and a business card that might represent her future. Appeared at her elbow. I am so sorry. I should have listened to you. I should have. It's fine, said, cutting him off. She was too tired for his apologies, too overwhelmed to process them. It's been a long night. Can I finish my shift? Take the rest of the night off, said quickly. Paid, and take tomorrow too. I'll work out some kind of compensation for what happened. I'll figure something out. Nodded, moved back to the service station to untie her apron for what she suspected might be the last time. As she did, she caught eye. He was grinning at her, a huge smile that conveyed pride and congratulations. David gave her a small nod of respect, even had emerged from the dish pit to watch her leave, his weathered face creased in a smile. She walked out of the Azure's kitchen door for the last time, stepping into the alley that smelled of grease and cigarettes and possibility. They were still in her pocket, those tools of resistance and hope that she'd been using to keep her mind alive during 6 months of survival. She pulled them out and looked at them in the dim light from the kitchen door, these small pieces of cardstock that represented who she really was beneath the uniform. She wouldn't need them anymore. The United Nations General Assembly Hall was nothing like the Azure's dining room, though both were places where powerful people gathered to conduct business. The soaring ceiling, the distinctive green marble, the curved rows of delegation seats. Kathleen had seen it in photographs, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of standing at the translator's station, wearing a tailored charcoal business suit that fit her properly because she could finally afford proper tailoring, her hair styled professionally, speaking into a microphone that carried her words to diplomats and delegates from around the world. Chairman O was at the podium, delivering an address about international trade ethics and the responsibility of business leaders to operate with integrity. His speech was in Korean, carefully crafted for this audience, and Kathleen was translating in real time, her years of training and her natural gift combining to render his words into English with precision and nuance. She'd been working for Chairman O's organization for 3 months now. The job was challenging in ways that engaged her intellect rather than depleting it. The medical benefits had kicked in immediately, and Dion's surgery had been scheduled for 2 weeks after she started. The transplant had been successful. Her little brother was recovering, gaining back the weight he'd lost, returning to the basketball court with the cautious enthusiasm of someone who'd been given their life back. Her mother had cried when Kathleen told her about the job, about the insurance, about the surgery being scheduled. They'd stood in their cramped apartment kitchen and held each other and cried together, the weight of a year's worth of fear and struggle finally lifting. In a hospital room in Chicago, Dion was watching the UN proceedings on television, his laptop open beside him as he tried to simultaneously follow the coverage and finish his homework. He'd sent Kathleen a text that morning. "My sister is translating at the UN. How am I supposed to concentrate on algebra? You're making me look bad." She'd sent back, "Focus on your algebra. Someone needs to be the family math genius since I clearly failed at that." His response had been a string of laughing emojis and a photo of him pointing at the television screen where she was visible in the background of a shot of Chairman O at the podium. As Kathleen translated Chairman O's closing remarks about honor and integrity in business, about treating all people with respect regardless of their station, about the responsibility of those with power to use it justly, she thought about that night at the Azure, about Chu Young-hee and his electric blue suit, his diamond watch, his arrogance that had contained the seeds of his own destruction, about the invisible wall she'd built to protect herself, and the moment she'd chosen to let it fall. She'd heard through the network of Chairman O's organization that Chu had been arrested 2 weeks after that night, charged with customs fraud and smuggling. Without organizational protection, he'd had no defense against the investigation that Chairman O had apparently been conducting for months. The frame-up at the restaurant had been the final piece of evidence needed to demonstrate his judgment was compromised, his methods unacceptable. Sometimes Kathleen wondered if she'd stayed calm that night because of strength or simply because she'd had no other choice. If the same situation happened now, someone trying to frame her, to destroy her credibility, to steal her future, would she be able to maintain that same composure? Or would the fear and rage she'd been suppressing behind the invisible wall finally break through? She didn't know. She hoped she'd never have to find out. But she knew this. She'd survived the worst night of her life by holding onto who she really was, by refusing to let someone else's cruelty define her reality. And that strength, that determination, had opened doors she hadn't known existed. Chairman O finished his speech, and the assembly hall erupted in polite applause. Kathleen completed her translation of the final line and sat back, her heart still racing slightly from the intensity of real-time translation at this level. Chairman O was stepping away from the podium, nodding to the assembly president, and as he passed the translator's station, he caught Kathleen's eye and gave her a small nod of approval. She nodded back, professional and composed, The woman she'd always been finally allowed to exist in a space that valued her gifts. Her phone buzzed with another text from Dion. "You were amazing. Mom's crying again. Happy crying this time." Kathleen smiled, typing back quickly before the next speaker needed translation. "Tell her I love her. Tell her we made it." Because they had. Against odds that had seemed insurmountable, against circumstances that had tried to break them, they'd made it through to the other side. And it had all started with the decision to let the invisible wall fall, to speak the truth in perfect, formal Korean, to refuse to be less than she was even when silence seemed safer. Kathleen kept her cool and won. But be honest, if someone framed you for a crime you didn't commit, would you have stayed calm or would you have snapped? Let us know in the comments.